What if I told you that darkness isn't just the absence of light, but sometimes it's a presence all its own? A vast, hungry void that waits patiently for the world to turn its back, to drop its guard, to plunge into shadow. And when that happens, when the familiar glow of civilization flickers and dies, sometimes something awakens. Something that thrives in the inky black, something that remembers old hurts and seeks a terrible, final justice. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories, because today, we're not just looking back at a cold case, we're stepping into the chilling, suffocating darkness of a night that Oak Haven, Pennsylvania, can never truly forget. A night when the lights went out, and the true horrors came to life. The last glow of Oak Haven, November 1989. Oak Haven, November 1989. Picture it, a quintessential American town nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Its main street was lined with brick buildings housing a bustling diner, a quaint bookstore, and the town hall with its proud, perpetually ticking clock tower. Autumn had painted the surrounding forests in fiery hues of crimson and gold, and the crisp November air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Kids bundled in scarves and mittens played tag in leaf-strewn yards, while families gathered around flickering televisions, the evening news droning softly in the background. Life here was a tapestry woven with predictable rhythms and a comforting sense of community. Everyone knew everyone, or at least, everyone thought they did. But beneath that placid surface, a different kind of chill was settling in, one that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. For days, the weather had been erratic. Unseasonable warmth one afternoon, followed by a sudden, brutal drop in temperature and howling winds by nightfall. There were whispers of solar flares, of an unstable power grid, but mostly, people just shrugged it off as typical late autumn weirdness. What they didn't know was that these atmospheric disturbances, these subtle shifts in the electrical currents of the world, were merely setting the stage for something far more profound, far more terrifying. At precisely 7:47 p.m. on November 14th, the world in Oak Haven didn't just go dark, it snapped. It wasn't a slow fade, not a flickering warning. It was an abrupt, absolute cessation. The television screens went black, the streetlights vanished, the hum of refrigerators died. The entire town, the entire region, was plunged into an inky, suffocating blackness so profound it felt less like an absence of light and more like a heavy, breathing entity pressing in from all sides. The initial reaction was a collective gasp, quickly followed by a strange, nervous laughter. Neighbors called out to each other from darkened porches. Kids, at first thrilled by the novelty, quickly grew uneasy as the minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The familiar world had vanished, replaced by a canvas of impenetrable night, where every creak of the house, every rustle outside, became magnified into something sinister. The true horror wasn't just the lack of light, but the sudden, terrifying realization of how utterly dependent they were on it, and how vulnerable they became without it. The first echoes of terror, a town holds its breath. For the first few hours, Oak Haven tried to cling to normalcy. Flashlights, hastily retrieved from dusty drawers, cast dancing shadows. Candles, lit with trembling hands, offered meager, flickering comfort. Radios, powered by rapidly draining batteries, crackled with emergency broadcasts that offered little more than vague assurances and predictions of a prolonged outage. But mostly, there was just the silence. A deep, unnatural quiet that settled over the town like a fresh snowfall, broken only by the distant, mournful howl of a dog or the nervous murmur of hushed conversations. Then, the whispers began. Not through phone lines, which were mostly dead, but through frantic shouts between houses, through hurried knocks on doors, through the terrified gasps of those who dared to venture out. The first report was vague, almost unbelievable. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a quiet, meticulous woman in her late 60s, known for her prize-winning roses and her unwavering commitment to the local church, lived alone in her charming, albeit somewhat isolated, Victorian home on Elm Street. When her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, went to check on her the following morning, a neighborly gesture in the wake of the blackout, she found the front door locked from the inside, just as Mrs. Vance always kept it. After repeated, unanswered knocking, a growing sense of dread compelled Mrs. Gable to peek through a gap in the curtains. What she saw sent a shiver down her spine. Mrs. Vance was in her parlor, seated in her favorite armchair, a half-finished embroidery project resting on her lap. Her eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, but there was an unnatural stillness to her, a terrible lack of life. Mrs. Gable, her heart pounding in her chest, managed to alert the few police officers still patrolling the darkened streets. Young Officer Miller, a fresh face just 6 months out of the academy, was among the first to arrive. He fumbled with his flashlight, its beam weak and wavering in the profound gloom of the unlit house. What he saw that morning would haunt his dreams for decades. There was no forced entry. None. The windows were latched, the back door bolted. It was as if the killer had simply materialized inside the locked house. Mrs. Vance showed no signs of struggle, there were no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture. She simply sat there, utterly peaceful, utterly lifeless. The official cause of death would later be listed as cardiac arrest, a heart attack. But Officer Miller, even then, felt a cold knot of suspicion. Her face, devoid of any terror, yet utterly devoid of life, seemed to hold a secret, an unspoken horror that transcended simple medical explanation. The lack of evidence was startling, almost infuriating. It was as if the darkness itself had wiped away any trace of the perpetrator, leaving only questions and a pervasive, creeping sense of dread. The air in Oakhaven, already heavy with the cold of autumn, now carried a new, far more profound chill, the icy grip of fear. A pattern in the dark, the shadow weaver's embrace. As the days crawled by, the power still out in much of Oakhaven, the initial shock gave way to a pervasive, gnawing fear. Candles became constant companions, and the streets, usually bustling, became eerily deserted after dusk. People huddled indoors, listening to the wind howl and to the unsettling reports that began to surface from other parts of town. 3 days after Mrs. Vance's discovery, Mr. Thomas Miller, a reclusive librarian known for his vast collection of rare books and his meticulous habits, was found in his study. Like Mrs. Vance, he was seated, a leather-bound volume open on his lap, his reading glasses perched on his nose. And like Mrs. Vance, there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. His death was also attributed to natural causes, a massive stroke. But the unsettling similarities were too stark to ignore. 2 prominent, solitary members of the community, found dead in their locked homes, seemingly without a struggle, during an unprecedented blackout. Then came the Petersons. David and Sarah, a young couple with a bright-eyed toddler named Emily, lived in a cozy bungalow on the outskirts of town. Their disappearance was noted first by Sarah's sister, who had tried to reach them for days. When a concerned neighbor finally broke a window to gain entry, they found the Peterson family tucked into their beds. David and Sarah lay side by side, holding hands, Emily nestled between them. They looked almost peaceful, as if they had simply drifted off to sleep and never woken up. Again, no forced entry. No signs of struggle. 3 perfectly healthy individuals, gone. The medical examiner, under immense pressure and with limited resources due to the blackout, listed their deaths as carbon monoxide poisoning, a plausible, if unproven, theory given the reliance on alternative heating sources. But there was no carbon monoxide detector in the house, and no obvious source of the gas. The lack of any struggle, the serene expressions on their faces, sent a collective shiver down the town's spine. The local police, led by the grizzled and increasingly frustrated Chief Thompson, were overwhelmed. Communication was sporadic, forensic capabilities were crippled, and the entire community was spiraling into paranoia. Who was next? How did the killer get in? Was it someone they knew? The media, when they finally managed to get reports out, dubbed the unknown assailant the Shadow Weaver. The name stuck, painting a terrifying picture of an entity that moved unseen, unheard, weaving its deadly web in the protective cloak of darkness. Neighborhood watch groups formed, armed with flashlights and a desperate sense of vigilance, but what could they watch for when the enemy seemed to be able to simply materialize within locked homes? The investigation became a desperate, fumbling scramble in the dark, yielding nothing but more questions and mounting dread. Chief Thompson, usually a picture of stoicism, began to show the strain, his eyes haunted by the faces of the victims and the impenetrable mystery surrounding their deaths. The investigation stalls, ghosts in the machine. The Oakhaven Police Department, accustomed to petty theft and the occasional bar fight, found themselves facing a nightmare beyond their comprehension. With the power out, their evidence lockers were dark, their computers useless, and their communication systems reduced to crackling two-way radios with limited range. Detectives, working by lantern light, meticulously scoured each scene, only to find nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no stray fibers, no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. It was as if the killer was a phantom, leaving no trace. Chief Thompson ordered house-to-house checks, a colossal undertaking in a darkened town. Every resident was questioned, every alibi scrutinized. The stress was palpable. Neighbors eyed neighbors with suspicion. Old grudges flared. A loner who lived on the edge of town, a man named Silas Blackwood, known for his eccentricities and his uncanny ability to navigate the woods in pitch black, became an early suspect. Officer Miller, still reeling from the Vance scene, was assigned to follow up on Silas. He spent days tracking the man, observing his movements, even confronting him. Silas, with his wild beard and piercing eyes, certainly looked the part of a shadowy figure, but his alibi was surprisingly solid. He had been holed up in his cabin, nursing a broken leg, and had witnesses who could attest to his immobility. Another dead end. Then came the theory of the drifter. With the roads open but the power out, it was plausible that someone had simply passed through, taking advantage of the chaos. Checkpoints were set up on the few roads leading into Oakhaven, stopping every vehicle. But no one suspicious was found, no one with a past that linked them to the victims. The frustration mounted, not just among the police, but among the townspeople. Fear turned to anger, anger to despair. The local newspaper, when it finally managed to print a limited edition using a generator, spoke of a town under siege, a community paralyzed by an invisible enemy. The emotional toll was immense. Families slept with furniture barricading doors, children cried themselves to sleep, and the once vibrant community spirit began to fray at the edges, replaced by suspicion and isolation. The Shadow Weaver wasn't just killing individuals, it was slowly, meticulously, suffocating the very soul of Oakhaven. Whispers from the past, echoes in the silence. Years later, when the case had long gone cold, filed away in dusty boxes marked unsolved, I started digging. My fascination wasn't with the sensational headlines, but with the quiet, overlooked details. The kind of details that only surface when people are truly terrified, when their usual filters are down, and they speak from a place of raw, unvarnished memory. I spent months in Oakhaven, long after the blackout had become a chilling local legend, interviewing anyone who would talk, poring over microfiches of old newspaper clippings, and sifting through the sparse, often contradictory, police reports. One detail kept surfacing, a subtle, almost poetic observation that seemed utterly out of place in the grim narrative. It came from a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who lived 2 doors down from the Petersons. I found her living in a retirement home, her memory still sharp, though tinged with a profound sadness. She recalled the night of the blackout, huddled with her family, listening to the eerie silence. It wasn't just quiet, she'd said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, decades later. It was a deep silence. Like the town was holding its breath. And then, sometimes, you'd hear it. A faint, sweet scent, almost like honeysuckle. But it was November. And it was just wrong. She described it as a fleeting aroma, sometimes strong enough to make her turn her head, sometimes just a faint ghost on the wind. She dismissed it at the time as her imagination, a symptom of stress. But as I cross-referenced, I found 2 other witnesses who independently mentioned a similar, out-of-place floral scent on the periphery of their memory from that terrifying night. An elderly man, Mr. Henderson, who lived across from Mrs. Vance, recalled a sweet, almost cloying smell that drifted past his window just before he heard a faint thud from Mrs. Vance's house. And a young paper boy, who had been brave enough to try and deliver papers the morning after the blackout, swore he caught a whiff of something floral near the Petersons' home, a smell he couldn't quite place, but one that felt profoundly unnatural for the season. These weren't professional investigators, just terrified citizens, but their collective memory painted a picture of something more than just a random monster. It suggested a presence, perhaps even a signature. A signature that, to my increasingly focused mind, felt less like a calling card and more like a twisted, nostalgic. The Oakhaven Children's Home, a rotting foundation. The official reports always assumed the killer was an outsider, someone who took advantage of the chaos. But what if that was wrong? What if the lack of forced entry wasn't about a master lockpicker, but about someone who didn't need to force entry? Someone who already had access. Or, even more disturbing, someone who was invited in. This line of thinking led me down a rabbit hole, away from the obvious and into the forgotten corners of Oakhaven's history. And that's where I found it, the Oak Haven Children's Home. It stood on the edge of town, a sprawling, Gothic revival structure that had once been a grand manor, later converted into an orphanage. It closed its doors abruptly in the early 1970s, after whispers of neglect, harsh discipline, and questionable financial practices finally reached the state authorities. For decades, it had been a source of quiet shame for Oak Haven, a stain on its otherwise pristine image. The building itself now stood derelict, its windows boarded up, its once manicured grounds overgrown with weeds and, ironically, wild honeysuckle vines that clung stubbornly to its crumbling brick walls. What struck me was the pervasive silence surrounding the orphanage. No one in Oak Haven liked to talk about it. But when I pressed, when I found the few remaining former staff members or neighbors who remembered, the stories emerged. Stories of strict, unfeeling matrons, of meager meals, of children left to their own devices for long stretches, their cries often ignored. There were rumors of a particularly cruel headmistress, Mrs. Albright, who ruled with an iron fist, and whose family happened to be the Petersons' ancestors. Mrs. Vance, the first victim, had been a longtime volunteer at the orphanage, known for her stern demeanor and her belief in tough love. Mr. Thomas Miller, the librarian, had served on its board of directors, often advocating for budget cuts that further reduced the children's quality of life. The connection was undeniable, chilling. All the victims, in different capacities, were tied to the Oak Haven Children's Home. They weren't random targets, they were carefully selected. They were the architects, the enforcers, the silent bystanders of a system that had, for years, inflicted profound suffering on vulnerable children. And the honeysuckle scent? It was said to have grown wild around the decaying wooden fence of the old children's home, a pervasive, bittersweet perfume that permeated the air on summer evenings. For a child trapped within its walls, that scent might have become inextricably linked to their trauma, a symbol of their forgotten pain. The investigator's notebook, Engineering the Darkness. The deeper I dug into the orphanage's past, the clearer the picture became. There was one child, in particular, who stood out in the scattered records and fragmented memories. A young boy, around 8 years old when the orphanage closed, known only as number 17 in the cold, impersonal logbooks. He was described as quiet, withdrawn, but intensely observant. He had no family to claim him, and his future after the closure was vague, lost in bureaucratic paperwork. But one detail about him resonated deeply: he had a particular fascination with how things worked. He would spend hours dismantling broken toys, studying the internal mechanisms of clocks, even sketching crude diagrams of the orphanage's rudimentary electrical system, much to the exasperation of the staff. The theory began to coalesce, chilling me to the bone. The Shadow Weaver wasn't some lurking stranger. It was a ghost from Oak Haven's own past, a survivor of the very institution the victims were connected to. One of the children, forgotten and neglected, who had carried a festering grudge for decades. Someone who knew the town's secrets, its vulnerabilities, and its people intimately. The lack of forced entry suddenly made terrifying sense. The victims weren't struggling because they weren't being attacked by an intruder. They were simply accepting. Accepting the familiar face, the quiet presence, the lingering scent of honeysuckle that brought back a forgotten memory. But the most terrifying revelation wasn't just the identity of the killer, but the nature of the blackout itself. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a meticulously planned stage. The Shadow Weaver, I now believe, had intimate knowledge of Oak Haven's aging electrical infrastructure. Perhaps they even worked for the local utility company at some point, or had a contact who did, quietly gathering information, learning the weak points of the grid. Oak Haven's power system, like many older towns, was a convoluted network of aging transformers, outdated substations, and overhead lines vulnerable to severe weather. A specific sequence of events, perhaps a calculated overload at a critical substation, or a precise sabotage of a key transmission line, could have triggered a cascading failure, plunging the entire region into darkness. The blackout wasn't just exploited, it was engineered. The extreme weather, the unseasonable warmth followed by cold, could have been a convenient cover, a natural event to blame for the engineered catastrophe. This wasn't just a killer, this was a brilliant, patient, and deeply wounded individual who spent years planning their retribution. They knew the layout of the victims' homes, their routines, their weaknesses. They were not breaking in, they were simply reclaiming a debt, a dark justice for a childhood lost and forgotten. Each victim represented a piece of the institution that had failed them, and in the suffocating blackness of Oakhaven, that debt was violently repaid. The honeysuckle scent? A chilling, personal calling card, a memory of a place that should have been a haven but became a prison. The unsettling revelation, a debt repaid in darkness. The final, unsettling truth is that the Shadow Weaver was never caught. The police, blinded by the darkness and hampered by their lack of resources, pursued conventional leads while the real killer moved like smoke through the unlit streets. They were too focused on the how of the murders, on the physical act, to consider the deeper why, the profound, decades-long grievance that fueled them. The killer melted back into society, perhaps even remained in Oakhaven, a quiet, unassuming citizen who carried a terrible secret and a profound, unfulfilled sense of justice. Imagine the sheer audacity, the chilling patience. To live amongst the very people who had once ignored your suffering, to meticulously plan not just the murders, but the very conditions under which they could occur. To orchestrate a blackout that would paralyze an entire town, creating the perfect canvas for their horrific artwork. The victims, in their final moments, likely saw not a monstrous stranger, but a familiar face, perhaps one they had long forgotten, or perhaps one they had never truly seen. A child, grown into an adult, seeking to finally be acknowledged, to finally be heard, in the only way they knew how, by silencing those who had silenced them. The carbon monoxide theory for the Petersons, the heart attacks for Mrs. Vance and Mr. Miller, these were convenient explanations, easily accepted in a town desperate for answers, desperate to believe that the darkness itself was the culprit, not one of their own. But the quiet, peaceful deaths, the lack of struggle, the honeysuckle scent, these were the killer's true signature. A twisted mercy, perhaps, a desire to spare them the terror they had inflicted upon children. Or perhaps, a final, chilling act of control, ensuring their victims died as quietly and unremarked upon as the children they had once overseen. The lingering aftermath, the unseen threat. The Oakhaven blackout of 1989 officially ended after 7 agonizing days. The lights flickered back on, slowly, hesitantly, casting long, nervous shadows. But the darkness never truly lifted from Oakhaven. The town was irrevocably changed. The initial shock gave way to a lingering paranoia, a quiet suspicion that never fully dissipated. Property values plummeted, businesses struggled, and the vibrant community spirit that once defined Oakhaven was replaced by a guardedness, a subtle fear of the unknown. People still locked their doors religiously, even on the brightest days. They still glance nervously at the sky when the weather turns, and a power flicker can send a ripple of unease through the entire town. The case of the Shadow Weaver remains open, a chilling testament to the darkness that can brew within a community, and the terrifying ways it can resurface when the lights go out. The killer could be anyone. Your quiet neighbor, the unassuming shopkeeper, the person you pass on the street every day. They walk among you, carrying their secrets, their childhood scars, and the knowledge of what they did in the dark. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when an old memory stirs, someone in Oakhaven might catch a faint, sweet whiff of honeysuckle, and a shiver runs down their spine, reminding them that some shadows never truly leave. And so, Oakhaven was left not just with the memory of a blackout, but with the terrifying realization that the monster wasn't from outside. It was born from within, nurtured by neglect, and unleashed by the very darkness it helped create. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what lurks in the dark, but what was already there when the lights went out, waiting patiently for its moment to strike again.